The Authors Guild Foundation is the educational and philanthropic branch of the Authors Guild,
America's oldest and largest professional organization for writers.
The Authors Guild Foundation educates, supports, and protects American writers
to ensure that a rich, diverse body of literature can flourish.
We do this by advocating for authors' rights,
educating authors across the country in the business of writing,
and promoting an understanding of the value of writers.
The foundation advocates on issues of copyright,
a right enshrined in Article 1 of the Constitution, guaranteeing authors the right to own and profit from their work.
We fight piracy and the theft of creative work.
We promote literacy and increased access to books in disadvantaged communities.
We advocate for increased funding and outreach for public libraries.
The Foundation believes that an abundance of free literary expression is essential to our democracy.
And that can only be achieved by protecting authors' constitutional and moral rights to benefit from their work.
The Authors Guild Foundation works on behalf of all writers, emerging, mid-career, and established writers in all genres.
Novelists and essayists.
Children and YA books.
Poets and translators.
Journalists and nonfiction authors.
Thriller and mystery writers.
You get the picture.
Through our many educational programs, the Authors Guild Foundation teaches writers the business of writing
and equips them with the knowledge and tools they need to succeed.
We foster and celebrate diverse voices in American literature
and promote the ability of writers to earn a livelihood so they can keep writing.
The foundation works to defend the author's right to free expression
and prevent erosion of the exchange of knowledge and ideas.
We advocate for strong, effective intellectual property laws,
as well as fair treatment of authors, so that writing remains a viable profession.
So if you love books, writing, literary culture, the written word,
moving poetry, excellence in journalism, the perfect thriller,
please make a donation.
All of us at the Authors Guild Foundation thank you so much for your support.
Thank you 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 for your support.
If you're following your program religiously, you will see that I am not Andre Bernard. He was supposed to introduce this session, but was called away. I am Lynn Bolger. I am the Executive Director of the Authors Guild Foundation. Welcome to Session 2 of the inaugural WIT Festival. Thanks. For those of you who were not here last night for the talk, and for those of you watching from home, When Religion Meets Science was our session title. We heard from Dan Brown about his first book that he wrote at age 5. Some memorable lines from the filming of The Da Vinci Code. My favorite was, "Could somebody get Mary Magdalene a Diet Coke?" And deeper themes about the history of gods and philosophical structures that we have used to answer the questions, who are we? Why are we here? And what happens to us after we die? The WIT Festival theme in this inaugural year is Reimagining America, and we are exploring this theme through a number of lenses: the climate crisis, history, identity and belonging, the Supreme Court, and this morning we will get all policy wonky on you and talk about the relationship between US and China. 50 years ago, Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China, ending 25 years of zero communication or diplomatic ties between the US and the PRC. But a lot has changed since 1972. China's rising and the power relationships in the international system have had seismic implications in bilateral relations between the two countries: economic, political, technological, humanitarian, and militaristic. Here to talk about this shift this morning, our former ambassador to South Korea and retired Naval Admiral Harry Harris and Simon Winchester, OBE. Simon will give a fuller introduction of Admiral Harris, but I am going to tell you about Simon, author, journalist, polymath, and the new editor of the prestigious literary journal Lapham's Quarterly. Many of you know Simon as he is living among you, but for those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting him, he is so darn charming. As his many books on myriad unrelated subjects suggest, he has almost a childlike curiosity in the world and sees threads of connection everywhere. It has been such a pleasure getting to know him as he has helped advise us and connect us to the local community. And I am going to let him take it from here. Thank you.
Great. Lynn, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, first of all, are these microphones working? Harry, do you want to say something? Just hello, so that we know that you're audible.
It's great to be here with you today.
It's great to be here. Yeah. Okay, enough of that. So that works. Thank you very much indeed. And first, one melancholy note, which Harry told me a few minutes ago. Many of you may know this, and this will not set the theme for the morning, but Hilary Mantel died. And that's desperately, anyone that has watched television over the last couple of years about Thomas Cromwell will know what extraordinary legacy she leads. However, this should not daunt us going forward. Now, I want to, first of all, we've got a tiny little map, and it turns out that on television screens, laser pointers don't really work, so I'm not going to be able to say very much about, but this is a map of the Pacific Ocean above us. And it's Harry, or was until he left 3 or 4 years ago, his area of responsibility as the commander of what's called Indo-PACOM, Indian and Pacific Ocean Commander, a vast amount of territory. And what I'm going to do very briefly is read what is at his, or was at his command, and then I'm just going to ask you. So 375,000 US military and civilian personnel, 130,000 sailors, 5 aircraft carrier strike groups, 86,000 Marines, 640 aircraft. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It is a vast, vast area of responsibility. And I want to ask, before we get into the long grass, if that's not an untidy metaphor when you're talking about oceans, how did you get into this? And your life story, Harry, is quite extraordinary. So let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born?
That is going back a little way.
I'm afraid it is.
I was born in Japan.
Right. I mean, that in and of itself, you have a Japanese mother and an American sailor father. Both sadly passed away now. But you were born at Yokosuka, which is the big base in Yokohama on the south side of Tokyo Bay, and moved when you were very young to, of all places, Tennessee.
That's correct. Yeah, my folks moved to Tennessee when I was 2, and my father was from Tennessee. So after he retired from the Navy, he went back home and took my mother and me to Tennessee.
And pretty hard scrabble existence. This is eastern Tennessee. Yeah, this is the Appalachians.
Yeah, it's on the western edge of Appalachia, on the Cumberland Plateau. We had no running water or electricity when we moved there. My mother had a privileged life before the war, and electricity, running water is part of that. And then when we went to Tennessee, she had none of that. So it was sort of like the old television comedy Green Acres, the Zsa Zsa Gabor character. That was sort of my mother, and living in that existence was interesting for her. I mean, it was great for me. I was a kid. I didn't know any different, but that was the life that she lived there.
We don't want to stray too far away, but Kobe, where she came from, was one of the 67 cities in Japan that were nearly obliterated by American B-29 raids. So this is before the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why do you think she, well, A, married an American, who had, after all, perpetrated this, and then moved to America. I mean, did you ever talk about this kind of thing?
Just a little bit, not much. But Kobe was carpet bombed. She lost her home, some of her family, I think 6 or 7 days before the end of the war. So it was at the very end of the war. At that time, she was born in 1927. I hesitate to do public math, but I think she was 17 when the war was over. And then she went to Yokohama to work for the Americans there.
As a translator?
As a translator typist.
Right.
Her aunt invited her to come up, and her aunt told her, my mother had 3 sisters, that you'll come and you'll live with me, and then you'll meet an American sailor, you'll marry him, and you'll set up housekeeping, and you'll invite Yukiko, the second oldest sister, and you'll repeat this, and that's exactly what they did.
All of them?
All 4 girls married American sailors, 1 married a Marine, and then they all went to America and they lived the American dream. But she never blamed America for the troubles that Japan entered into. She blamed the militarist regime in Japan for that.
So to me, it boggles the mind that someone growing up in Appalachia with no electricity and no running water could, in a relatively short period of time, rise through the ranks of the Navy to get to essentially the most senior position, not technically quite the most senior, but to have aircraft carriers and aeroplanes and Marines all at your disposal as assets. Briefly describe your program. I mean, you went from Tennessee to Florida, is that right, to Pensacola? Yeah. And then what, saw an airplane and said, I got to fly this sucker?
It. So that's essentially it. I mean, I don't want to overstate the running water electricity thing.
You mean it's not true? You mean you did?
I mean, that's true. But we did not have it for all of my growing up in Tennessee. It took my dad a couple of years to put all of that stuff in. But we moved to Pensacola, Florida when I was going into junior high school.
Why did you move? Because he was still with the Navy?
No, he was long retired, but he wanted to, I think he wanted to improve my education, which I'm not sure where you go to Pensacola, Florida, but
not today, maybe.
Yeah, right. But I did have a great education in Pensacola, to be fair to my teachers there. But we moved to Pensacola, and he got a job, a paying job, at the Naval Air Rework Facility. He was a machinist mate in the Navy, and so he used those skills to earn a living in Pensacola. I went to high school in Pensacola, Booker T. Washington High School, and I joined the junior ROTC. And that really opened my eyes to the opportunities that the military provided young women and men in America. Now, I graduated from high school in 1974. The junior ROTC introduced me to the idea of the Naval Academy. So I thought I'd apply. I would apply to that. I went home, told my old man that, and I thought his head was going to explode because he was an enlisted man. And the one thing he hated officers. And he said, son, don't you know that the Naval Academy, they make officers out of that place? So, but I went to the Naval Academy, and that opened up my eyes to all the opportunities that the Navy provided, and it's public education. So thank you very much, all of you, for that. The Navy sent me to graduate school downrange. Again, thank you all for that. And then one day led to another, and another led to a year, and 1 year led to another year, and 4 decades later, I retired from the Navy.
I mean, your passion within the Navy seems to have been flying,
right,
rather than driving ships. I'm sure you did both, but
right. No, I did not. I'm not a fan of ships. So.
You're not a fan of ships,
right?
Right. Okay. Well, we can maybe explore that later. Yeah. But your Twitter handle is iFlyP3s.
Right.
So did you cut your teeth, as it were, on flying or on navigation or on?
I'm a backseater and a naval flight officer. That's one of the fellows in the back. It's not the person who flies. If you saw Top Gun 1, I'm Goose. Goose didn't make it, I'm just saying. But that's what I did. Right. I flew for 25 years or so. And then when I made flag, I stopped flying when I made one-star Admiral, I stopped flying. Then did other operations.
And did you see combat?
I did.
Where did you?
Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, Iraqi Freedom, Iraq, Odyssey Dawn, Libya.
You ticked all the boxes.
Right. Thank
you. And in these planes you flew were fighters? I mean, they were all...
They're land-based maritime patrol, reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare, that kind of thing.
Have you taken off and landed on an aircraft carrier?
I have, but in the back seat.
Terrifying?
No, actually.
And then what was the first major capital ship you served on?
USS Saratoga was the only ship I was assigned to.
Right. And that was in the Pacific? Or?
No, that was based out of Mayport, Florida. It was a conventional, non-nuclear powered aircraft carrier. And we deployed, this was in 1985, we deployed to the Mediterranean. And we were involved in, the ship was involved in the capture of the hijackers of the Achille Lauro, Egypt Air 737. And then that was the beginning of the deployment. We went through the Suez Canal, worked in the Indian Ocean, came back through, and then did the Libya strikes in 1986.
When you mentioned the Indian Ocean, I just want, as a little aside, did you go to Diego Garcia?
Yeah, I went to Diego Garcia in every flying tour that I had.
Can I just take a brief time out here? Diego Garcia is a British colony still.
British Indian Ocean Territory.
BIOT. And there used to be a Royal Air Force runway there for planes that were going from Britain to Australia.
Right.
And the Americans did a deal with the British government in about 68, I think it was, to build this gigantic arrangement in the middle of nowhere, which is still technically British. And I went there once. You're not allowed to, but I went there in a yacht from the Maldives and got thrown out. I mean, it was a pretty remarkable experience. But I've sort of, anyone that ever goes to Diego Garcia, I mean, what goes on there? It's huge. It's an atoll shaped a bit like a child's foot. Yeah. And you enter from the northern end. And when we went in their tiny yacht, it's full of cargo ships loaded to the gunwales with tanks and armored vehicles for deployment in the Middle East, largely.
Right. Exactly right. So it's MPF, Maritime Prepositioning Force. Ships are there in the harbor that do, in fact, have tanks and other military equipment loaded to the gunwales for that reason. A giant runway capable of launching B-52s and B-1s and all of that, P-3s. And it's a strategic asset for the United Kingdom. And there's an agreement that allows the United States to operate out of there. But it is British Indian Ocean territory. We're reminded of that every day, in a good way. And so it's quite a unique place to operate from.
Well, tell us, moving on from the Indian Ocean, although that is in your area of responsibility, it's going to be sort of cumbersome, me getting up to point at the map because the laser pointer doesn't work on the television. But basically, on the extreme left of the screen is the Indian Ocean. You've got, if you can see it, there's Indonesia, there's Australia, there's, of course, China, Vietnam, all that stuff. And then, I should think another 1,500 miles, which encompasses Burma and India. And your area of responsibility stops essentially south of Pakistan, right? There's a line
just west of the Maldives.
Right.
So if you drew a straight line, if you drew a straight line from the Maldives downward,
I mean, it's far and away the largest command in the world.
52% of the globe.
52% of the globe comes under your authority, effectively.
Well,
I mean, you reply.
U.S. forces, under my former authority. Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
But I mean, you were making the point in the green room earlier. I said, well, technically, it doesn't extend to the coast of California. You use this phrase. You can utter it. What is it?
Well, it's my forces are based in California, right? San Diego, Camp Pendleton, up into Washington State, all the military installations there, and all of the forces in Alaska. So
but the phrase, I want you to have the opportunity, the Hollywood.
Oh, yeah. I used to describe the Indo-Pacific region, the coverage, as from Hollywood to Bollywood, penguins to polar bears, or penguins to polar bears.
Yeah, penguins are, right, right. Enormous. I mean, I'm still, as I say, staggered that someone from such relatively humble beginnings, and should ascend to that. Your headquarters, which I've been to, Camp Howling Mad Smith, H.M. Smith, up in the hills above Pearl Harbor. But, and I don't want to linger on this point too much, but you are a Nisei. I mean, you're half Japanese. Pearl Harbor, there was a long period, was there not, when Japanese, people of Japanese extraction were not permitted to be in Pearl Harbor?
I don't know that for a fact, but during at the beginning of, after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans of Japanese descent on the West Coast were rounded up and put into
concentration camps.
These camps. And then some in Hawaii were also, but they could not do that whole scale in Hawaii due to the numbers of Japanese Americans there.
I mean, is there not a certain sense of irony of a half Japanese person running Pearl Harbor?
Sure.
I mean, did people remark on this to you? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it was a source of pride for me.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
And a source of pride, I believe, for all of the Nisei groups in Hawaii. But this is America, right? I mean, that's not that unusual in the 21st century. It may have been unusual in the 20th century, but I think it's less so today.
So let's dive a little deeper then into your responsibilities in the Pacific. I remember I used to live in Hong Kong, and back in the 80s, I should think, 90s, I took a container ship from Port Klang in Malaysia to Hong Kong, and we went through the South China Sea and sidled past, it was called the Cardigan Bay, so it's 250,000 tons. I mean, you don't sidle, but we passed very close to the Spratly Islands. Yeah. Now, back in those days, the Spratly Islands, there were things going on. There was the Chinese flag flying. These are islands that were uninhabited, very low-lying, and we were ordered to slow down. And I remember the captain of the ship on the port bridge wing taking photographs. And when we arrived in Hong Kong, a British naval officer took the roll of film. That was back in the days when we had rolls of film. Yeah. So clearly the West, the outside world, was interested in what was going on in the South China Sea. What then went on from, let's say, the early 90s to today that made people like yourself and your bosses slightly alarmed?
Yeah, so the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has claimed the majority of the South China Sea as territorial water space. And it derives from this fantastical claim called the 9-dash line. There were literally 9 dashes on a map that encompassed the entire South China Sea, almost the entire South China Sea. So the PRC claims that as territorial waters and everything in it, including these rocks and other low-level, low-tide formations like the Spratlys, like the Paracels, and all of that. Along about 2012, the Chinese started to build bases out of these low-lying elevations in the South China Sea. What they would do is they would carve up the water space, the sea space, the seabed around it, and then literally pour it into the super low-lying areas of the Spratlys, and pour concrete over that, and turn these rock formations into big runways, big bases capable of handling aircraft of any size. And they did this to 7 or 8 of these formations. Some were essentially command and control outposts, some were runways, some were barracks and billeting and all of that.
We want to say, of course, that these islands they weren't American islands, of course. They were claimed by the neighboring states, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, indeed. And everyone was saying, why are the Chinese taking them? and yet no one could do anything about it. No one ever did anything
I mean,
about it.
Is it worth going to war over in 2012? Probably not. The other countries lack the capability, the capacity to challenge China militarily. The Philippines, on the other hand, took a legalistic approach. Good for them for doing it. And they challenged the Chinese claims in the ITLOS tribunal. ITLOS is International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. The ITLOS tribunal ruled against China. They said that the 9-dash line has no basis in law, and therefore it's invalid. So this was the ruling of the United Nations body called the ITLOS tribunal, not the United States, and all that. We're not a signatory. The U.S. is not a signatory to the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The PRC is. So typical, in my estimation, the Chinese will ignore those agreements to which they've signed on to themselves, and this is just another one of those cases.
So that was an indication from the point of view of some people, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House particularly, that China was beginning to flex her muscles. And this, of course, has accelerated in recent years with the rapid expansion of the Chinese Navy.
Right.
I mean, the Chinese Navy now is, I believe, bigger than ours.
Right, numbers-wise.
In numbers, yeah.
Certainly not capability-wise, not today.
Okay, well, we'll talk about capabilities in a minute, but roughly what have they got? I mean, in terms of aircraft carriers, for instance.
Aircraft carriers, they have 2 now, and they're building a 3rd. And their carriers are small. They can't launch and recover aircraft at the same time like the U.S. can. And the aircraft are not carrier capable as U.S. aircraft are. So today, it's a severe mismatch. However, they're learning, they're getting better, they're building more. We think they'll have 7 or 8 of these by the end of the decade. Probably.
Really?
Yeah. And pure numbers-wise, they outnumber all of the forces that I had when I was the Indo-PACOM commander by 2 to 1 in the Pacific.
So we've talked briefly of the South China Sea, and you would order patrols through that water space to freedom of navigation, right, to make it clear to everyone that however many bases there may be dotted around, the navigation of all ships should be guaranteed. And America does that. You and the Australians, who does that?
Well, the Canadians just went through the Taiwan Strait with us.
I was going to come to that.
Yeah. Each country has to make its own decision whether it's going to challenge the PRC claims directly. And if, I don't want to get into technical stuff because it's incredibly boring, but if you have a feature that was a low tide elevation, which means that at high tide it's underwater, that doesn't have any provenance at all. And if you build on it, it still has no provenance. And so those features we would sail within 12 miles of, even though China claims them, even though China has built.
And what would China do in response? It would tell you to go away?
So far, they will complain. That's all they've done.
Right, complain.
Yeah.
All right, well, moving further north now, and I think we all know where Taiwan is, that's clearly the number one problem, is it not? And as demonstrated recently by Nancy Pelosi's visit.
Which I supported, by the way, and I think she had to do it.
Yeah, and there have been subsequent visits, have there not?
Of course, yeah. I mean, Senator Markey went right after.
Yeah, exactly, Massachusetts man, so exactly. So, what's the distance, coast of China to Taiwan?
100 miles.
So
open ocean.
Trivial, yeah.
Not trivial if you're trying to do an amphibious
trivial
landing.
in terms of logistics.
Right.
And the Canadians and the Americans sailed through it just
last week.
Last week, to once again demonstrate, as they do in the South China Sea, the importance of free navigation. How worried are you? I mean, okay, put it this way. What is China up to?
Yeah, so I think China has been clear what their objective is with regard to Taiwan. They've been clear all along that they believe that Taiwan is a runaway province and they intend to bring it back into the fold. peacefully if possible, forcefully if necessary. They have been very clear about that from day one. We have a policy of strategic ambiguity. Are we going to defend Taiwan or not? Don't know. Can't say. Won't say. So we keep this
close to your chest.
Yeah, close to somebody's chest for sure. And I have called in the last year or so that we need to change our policy, and it's just a policy. It's not in the Constitution. It's not a law. That we should change our policy of strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan and change that into a policy of strategic clarity. And I say that because of three constituencies, right? The first constituency is the Taiwanese. They ought to know if the United States is going to defend them or not. And if the answer is no, then they can make those decisions that follow from that. What kind of military hardware to buy, what kind of relationship with the PRC to have, and all of that. But they ought to know. The Chinese ought to know. The People's Republic of China, Chinese, mainland Chinese, ought to know. What is the United States going to do? You know, you can, if they make the decision to forcibly bring Taiwan back into their fold. But the most important constituency is the American people. It's your sons and grandsons and daughters and granddaughters that are going to be fighting that fight if we decide to defend Taiwan. So you ought to know, and the young women and men who are wearing the cloth of our nation ought to know that they have signed on to a fight with China or not. And so that's why I've argued for a changing of our policy from one of strategic ambiguity to strategic
just
clarity.
to nail you down personally, the clarity you want is to say we will defend Taiwan.
Yes.
Right. So
and also, there's a part of that with Taiwan too. You know, we do believe, I do believe, in the one China policy, and U.S. The military, the U.S. policy, is derived from law, which is the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a law. And the Taiwan Relations Act does not obligate us to defend Taiwan, but it does obligate us to provide for Taiwan's defense. And this is not like the Ukrainian sense where we give them stuff. I mean, Taiwan's a rich, powerful country. They buy stuff. And so our obligation is to provide them the military hardware that they need to defend themselves. And in the Taiwan Relations Act, a peaceful reconciliation between Taiwan and the PRC is encouraged, but a forceful reconciliation is not. But the Taiwan Relations Act doesn't go as far as to say what we would do, what we're obligated to do, should China decide to forcibly.
But your knowledge of the Taiwanese indicates surely to you that a peaceful, they're not going to allow themselves to be subsumed.
I think that if you looked at the situation a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago, there was every possibility of a peaceful reconciliation. Integration across the Taiwan Strait, integration economically, and all of that was ongoing, right? But lately being the last decade or so, the PRC has demonstrated what kind of partner it is. You need look no further than Hong Kong in that experience.
Yeah.
That I think Taiwan has moved further away from that. But on the strategic clarity piece, we don't want Taiwan to declare independence either, right? And so I think we should be equally clear to Taiwan, just as I'm advocating we be equally clear to the PRC.
I want to go back briefly to the expansion of the Chinese Navy. As far as I recall, there were these doctrines. The 9-dash line is one of them, but the others, the first island chain, the second island chain, the third island chain. This was a doctrine advanced by a PRC admiral. As it happens, the man who was in charge of the Tiananmen Square operation. So the way the Chinese military is organized, you know better than I, is it's all called the PLA, brackets Navy, PLA, brackets Air Force. So the PLA commander who put down the student uprising in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 ran for a very, I think he's dead now actually, isn't he? Ran for a very long time China's naval policy in the Western Pacific, which included we must extend our abilities to the first island chain, which is once again, I could go to this map, but basically islands relatively close to the Chinese mainland?
If you drew a straight line from the Kuril Islands north of Japan, through Japan, through Okinawa, down into the Philippines and across, that would be the first
island. Second island chain?
Guam, Marianas.
Right. That's expanding eastwards. And the third island chain, of course, comes to Hawaii.
Right.
And the thought, I mean, you must find it somewhat intimidating, bizarre, the thought that Chinese naval operations could be taking place off Waikiki.
Yeah, so the idea was, by Admiral Liu, was that they would have dominance to the first island chain in about 2020 or so. And then 2030 or so, they would have dominance out to the second island chain. And then by 2040, they would control the broad ocean areas, such that the United States could operate in the Pacific, but not threaten China at all.
Right.
And so the third island chain is really the broad ocean area.
And that is the extraordinary big picture shift that America has regarded the Pacific Ocean ever since the Spanish-American War, if you like, and Americans taking over the Philippines, as being an American lake. Now, would you agree with that?
I wouldn't go quite that far. I think the French might have a different view of that.
Well, the French have a different view of everything. With great
spoken from a former Brit, but the French Polynesia. If you added up this idea of EEZ, Economic Exclusion Zone, which is 200 miles out and all that, France becomes the sixth largest country in the world because of the French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and all the other island territories. That if you add a 200-mile thing around it, it becomes significant. But the United States' position has never been one of exclusivity with regard to the Pacific or any other body of water. What we believe in is adherence to international rules and norms and good behavior. And I believe that the Chinese are not exercising good behavior, and they certainly aren't following international rules and norms.
This leads naturally to the islands in the middle of the Pacific. I mean, places that we think of as just sun-kissed, palm tree fronded, white sands, beautiful places from Tahiti, the Carolines, Cook Islands, wherever. What's happening there? Because some strange, bizarre occurrences, the Solomon Islands, for instance. Solomon Islands, former British territory, now independent country.
Guadalcanal. On the Solomons,
exactly.
Right? So we have an interest there.
We do indeed, but what is happening as far as the Chinese?
So on the Solomons, they have signed a pact of some sort. It's not clear exactly what's in it, with the PRC, with China. And that created a lot of excitement in Washington. Kirk Campbell went straight out there and had a discussion. Kirk Campbell is the National Security Council's guy for Asia. And then had that discussion with the head of the Solomons there. But that pact is in force, whatever is in it. Most recently, a United States Coast Guard cutter was denied entry into the Solomons, even though they had been arranged for it to come there. So that becomes problematic if the PRC establishes a naval foothold in the South Pacific. To some extent, though, that's on us. That's our fault. We had an embassy in the Solomons until the 1990s when we decided to pull out of the Solomons, pull the embassy out. So when that vacuum occurred, the PRC immediately moved in. I was in Fiji maybe 2 months ago now, 6 weeks ago, and we have an embassy in Fiji that's responsible for 4 other countries. So the U.S. ambassador to Fiji is accredited to 4 other countries. If I tried to name them, I would get in trouble because I could name 3 at a drop of a hat. Right. The 4th one I'd have trouble with. But Tonga is one.
I think Kiribati must be one of them.
Kiribati,
I mean,
Tonga,
Kiribati, just parenthetically, is an extraordinary country because it's so vast, it extends over both northern and southern hemispheres and across the international date line. So at any one time, it's summer, winter, today and tomorrow and yesterday,
That's right.
all at the same time.
So you've got Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, Fiji, and these countries are there. And so the Biden administration announced 2 months ago that we're going to, in fact, build an embassy in Kiribati and either Vanuatu or Tonga. So recognizing the importance. So we're going to put an embassy there with embassy foreign service officers headed up by an ambassador, a Senate confirmed ambassador, and all that, which is the right thing to do. But the fact that we don't have one there, the fact that we pulled out of Tonga, the fact that it took 18 months to get my replacement in Seoul, the fact that it took 18 months to get Caroline Kennedy confirmed into Canberra in Australia, the fact that it took 3 years to get an ambassador into Ukraine, the fact we still don't have an ambassador to India, and we wonder why India is not harder on Russia, is on us. You know, this is an indication of the divided political landscape in Washington.
So exactly, and also the divided political landscape in Washington, but also the whole business of the 4-year cycle. That everything,
that's right,
all the congressmen, women, all they do is agitate
that's
to get re-elected.
But generally, in the ambassadorial ranks, if you are a career ambassador, when the administration changes, when the party of the administration changes, then those ambassadors are kept in place. But the political appointees, and I was one, the political appointees leave when the party in power leaves.
Right.
And so that's why we had the gap in Australia, India, South Korea, and Ukraine was gapped for a different reason, all political.
But meanwhile, the Chinese are doing what they've always done, which is to take the long view, to play the long game. I mean, that famous, probably apocryphal remark of Zhou Enlai when asked what he thought of the French Revolution in 1789, he said, it's a little too early to tell. And, but the wisdom of the Chinese in playing, whether their game is a sinister long game, whatever, they are playing it, and America is constantly being wrong-footed.
Yeah, and the Chinese are a learning machine. You know, they learned, they watched, observed, learned from the strengths of the U.S. military in Desert Storm, and then they changed their military philosophy, their equipment and stuff in an attempt to counter us in the Pacific. And I believe they're watching and learning from Russia's experience in Ukraine.
So, okay, you somewhat disagree with my saying that the Pacific was traditionally an American lake. What if it became, though, a Chinese lake?
Yeah,
would that be good or bad for the world?
It'd be bad.
Why?
It'd be bad for all the countries that
Why?
became that would become vassal states of the PRC. It would be, you need look no further than Sri Lanka at the outcome of mortgaging your country's future to the PRC.
I mean, what has happened in the last 2 months?
The last 2 months, they're in economic, they're in collapse economically.
And do you describe that directly to their engagement with the PRC?
I do.
And of course, you
can draw a straight line to the port deal in Hambantota.
And of course, I've lived in Hong Kong for many years, and it is tragic what's happening in Hong Kong.
Right. And I'll just comment then that the Biden administration's view of the PRC is consistent with the Trump administration's view. Secretary Blinken testified during his confirmation hearing that what's happening in Xinjiang is genocide. And genocide is a very strong word in diplomacy. But Blinken characterized China's actions in Xinjiang and Muslim Western China as genocide. He emphasized that what's happening in Hong Kong is the trampling of democracy and all of that. So the State Department's view is consistent across the administrations. Secretary Austin, the Secretary of Defense, testified that he is that China is the pacing threat facing the United States for certainly the rest of this decade, and he promised strong support for Taiwan.
So President Biden has made it abundantly clear, as he did at the at the UN earlier this week that Russia under Putin is a menace.
Right.
Thus far, comments about the PRC and Xi Jinping has been much more respectful and guarded, regard China as a competitor rather than a threat. But it sounds as if you see China as a threat.
Yeah, I would take a stronger view. One, I'm out of government now, so I can't. But I view China as an adversary. Notwithstanding what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I mean, Russia remains an existential threat to the United States. And you have to be focused on the fight at hand, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But long-term wise, I view China as the long-term
as a threat. Well, in that case, this rather could be a sort of a bit of an inside baseball discussion, which we don't want to have really. But would America, who would win a shooting war, a naval war between China and the United States now?
No question.
You would.
States.
We would.
No question. Today.
But in 10 years' time?
It depends on if the military is resourced correctly, our military, because as I said, China is looking, watching, observing, and learning, and they are increasing their capability of their military, of their navy.
I mean, that watching and learning began. What was the famous incident when there was a task force group in the Philippine Sea, I think, and they noticed a submarine.
Right.
Astern, a couple of miles, watching everything that was going on. And suddenly everyone realized, my God, they're watching us. They're watching everything we're doing.
Right.
And now they've developed a missile, have they not, which is an evident carrier killer.
Yeah,
you could lose your carriers very quickly.
Yeah, but I think that we have ways to counter those missiles without going into detail. But they are learning. And they also have hypersonic missiles, which we don't have. And so we have to catch up to them in that one space, the hypersonic weapons space.
Which brings the title of this talk is China and America, comes the moment, comes the man, is the famous quote. Yeah. It does look as if things are heading towards a moment when we've got to take notice.
So my successor at Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command, Phil Davidson, he actually put a date certain on it. He said 2027. He said 6 years. And he said that last year, so that would be 2027. And so that has become known in Navy circles as the Davidson moment. And so he put it in. I used to say that the 2020s is the decade of danger, but I wouldn't put a date on it. But Davidson actually said 2027.
That's interesting because the PRC has long regarded 2047 as being the date, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic.
But Xi Jinping moved the capability date to 2027 also. So that becomes, that's right around the corner. That's within the DOD's budget cycle, the FIDP, the 5-year defense plan.
So are they waking up in Washington, in your view?
In my view, they are.
More so awake under the Biden administration than under the Trump administration?
I think evolutionary. Right. So the Trump administration, I think, had the right sight picture on the threat posed by the PRC, and I think the Biden administration is actually putting teeth behind their response.
I say in conclusion, because I know there's going to be a moment when Lynn is going to bound up to the lectern and say, we're going to open this up to the audience, but we haven't talked at all about your last job, which was, of course, ambassador. Very distinguished and critical job, ambassador in Seoul to South Korea. Is the whole Korean peninsula and Kim Jong-un and his saber rattling, is it essentially a sideshow to the whole circum-Pacific?
No, I don't think it's a sideshow at all, because Kim Jong-un is not a...
Who you've met.
I've met, and he's very serious about what he intends and what he's long intended. I do believe that Kim Jong-un wants 4 things. He wants sanctions relief, he wants to keep his nuclear weapons, he wants to split the alliance, and he wants to dominate the peninsula. So he's being very clear about that. And this idea that somehow we could get North Korea to denuclearize, I think is very naive. And Kim Jong-un himself said it just 2 weeks ago, that North Korea as a nuclear capable state is irreversible. That's the translated, that's what he said, irreversible. And he intends to never give up his nuclear weapons. Well, I mean, Maya Angelou said, you know, when someone shows you who they are, you ought to believe them the first time, right?
Right.
And so Kim Jong-un has showed us who he is, as has Putin, over and over again, and shame on us if we don't believe in them the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, and on and on.
Terrifying, really. The American forces in Korea, is their principal role to guard, to defend Korea, or be an asset for you in the Pacific generally?
Their first and foremost role is to defend the peninsula, and then they're an asset also. But their role is to defend Korea, and they themselves won't do it by themselves. The ROK, the Republic of Korea military, armed forces, is very capable, and then all of the other assets based in Japan, based on the west coast of the United States, all of that will fall in defending the...
Before Lynn, who has arrived as a spectre behind us, I just want to ask you, are the Japanese and the Koreans, as far as you know, content still to have American forces on their soil?
For sure. But they're, unfortunately, the Japanese and the Koreans don't get along. And that's problematic for us as their only ally, right? And so the relationship between Japan and South Korea is fraught with bad history across the 20th century. I believe that the new president of South Korea, President Yoon, is doing the right thing in making an outreach to Japan to somehow mend fences enough, at least in the security space. And I believe that Prime Minister Kishida in Japan is also to be commended for his willingness to reach across that body of water. I say that body of water because they cannot even agree on the name
where
of the
it
body
ends,
of
where
water.
it begins, right?
Well,
What to call it.
The naming,
right.
The naming convention. So we just won't name it at all. We'll just say that body of water.
That body of water.
And so, you know, hopefully they'll be able to have a relationship in the security dimension that's helpful.
Do you miss either of these two amazing jobs, or are you glad you're out of it?
I don't miss the jobs, but glad to be out of it is probably an overstatement. You know, I'm glad to be where I am.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm glad to have done those jobs.
Yeah.
But that's looking backwards, and I try to look forward.
Sure. Lynn, over to you.
We do have time for a couple of questions, and how we'll do it is I will, if you raise hands, I will repeat your questions. So how about right here? Yes, you, sir?
First of all, thank you very much, Admiral, Ambassador. Couple of questions. First, Admiral Strategic said 2034 in his book. My real question is, a shooting war in Taiwan, the ramifications of that, in my mind, are just worldwide tremendous. Have an air missile, an air bomb, landing on TSMC foundry, sets the world back in terms of high-end chip production back to 1990. And I'm sure China, I don't know for anything, but I'm sure China realizes this, and it would not benefit them, it would not benefit any other country in the world. Would they take the risk?
So the question is, would China take the risk in a shooting war in Taiwan?
Yeah, it's the fundamental question, right? I mean, would they, and what would we do if they do? So I believe that the PRC does not want to do that, because if Xi Jinping craves anything, it's stability in the international order, so that he can continue to shape that order in his favor. So the PRC would like to take Taiwan without a shot fired. You know, this is the Sun Tzu's thing about, you beat your enemy before you fire the first shot. And so, they would like that. The Taiwanese, I believe, would not like that, right? I mean, being the country that they are. And then you go back to the issues that we discussed without rehashing it about whether we would defend them or not. At the end of the day, if Taiwan declared independence, I do believe that would be too much a finger in the eye of the PRC, and they would have to do something. So hopefully it won't come to that. So that's why I think the strategic clarity is important. I mean, I think, you know, what's the last example of strategic clarity? It was Ukraine, when the United States said clearly, without doubt, that we would not put troops into Ukraine. Thank you very much, and Russia moved in. And so I think that we need to be clear about that, not only for the three constituencies I talked about earlier, but also so that the PRC understands fully that a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan could bring the United States into the fight. So that should be a huge deterrent to Xi Jinping's ambitions. And at the same time, we should deter Taiwan's proclivity to declare independence, if you will. And I think that'll then protect Taiwan, protect TSMC, protect the shipbuilding, and all that.
But can I just throw one, I know you don't really want me to speak at all, Lynn, but it's perfect, is the zero COVID policy within China is causing a groundswell of opposition to Xi Jinping,
right,
which will presumably be crushed mercilessly, but nonetheless, mercilessly.
As we've seen that happen.
We have seen, we certainly have. But it's somewhat a faint echo of what was happening in Argentina in 1982, when the regime had to do something to bring the people back, and they invaded the Falkland Islands. So strange events produce weird outcomes, and Taiwan is more, in my view anyway, more in a greater peril at the moment. Maybe it'll fade away than it has been for some while.
Yeah, I think I take a little bit different view in that I think the problems that are facing the PRC today, their COVID issues, the economic issues, and what's happening in Ukraine, has got to cause Xi Jinping to take a step back. I mean, he's got to be wondering, when he looks at Ukraine, if his army is as bad as Russia's army is. If his generals are as bad, I'll just say there's nothing admirals like better than criticizing generals. If his generals are as bad as Russia's generals are, if the PLA Navy is as bad as the Black Sea Fleet is, and so you know, his equipment, his strategy, his tactics are Soviet-derived, even though they're made indigenously. They're Soviet-derived equipment and tactics, and they haven't been at war since 1979, when Vietnam kicked her ass. And so, you know, they're not combat tested, combat proven military.
And also, it has to be said that their aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, is Ukrainian.
That's right.
It was bought from the Ukrainians.
It was.
Right.
It was. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Lynn.
Lynn. Hi. Up there, Sherry. Yeah.
Wow.
Mr. Ambassador.
Hi.
I want to challenge a couple of things. One is, you said that China, the relationship of troops on the ground is 2-to-1, and we lost Korea, which Hampton Sides chronicles on desperate grounds, where they beat us. They had more troops than we did. I want to push back on the idea that we should defend Taiwan in light of the fact we've had disastrous pullouts in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and all these other places. We're a country that's desperately split politically, which you've mentioned to. How can a country like this come together to defend an island that's so far away? And in light of the fact that we've lost all these other battles, and the fact that we put so much money into these other places, we economically are behind a lot of our peers. We don't have bullet trains the way they have in Japan. We don't have the trains that Germany and Switzerland have. So why would we want to put money and people to defend Taiwan so far away in light of the fact that we've lost all these other wars?
Yeah, I'm not sure that our outcomes in Afghanistan and Vietnam and our political divided landscape in Washington, I don't know that those would cause us to not defend a country like Taiwan. You know, we're gonna defend South Korea. We have 28,500 troops there now and hundreds of thousands to back them up. We're going to defend Japan. We have 55,000 troops stationed there. And, you know, we're going to defend Albania, if you will, because Albania is a NATO country. And I think it's important for these countries to trust the United States that we're going to live up to our international obligations. Now, we don't have that obligation with Taiwan.
Right. What do we gain from defending Taiwan?
Japan, South Korea, and everywhere else that China might have an eye on.
So you think that it would be a domino effect?
It could. It could be. It could be a domino effect if we didn't help Ukraine to the level that we've been helping them. Because I think, you know, Moldova's next. In fact, Moldova has been attacked already. Putin has his eye on the former Soviet republics, you know, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, and on and on. The Baltics also, but the fact that the Baltics are in NATO is different and difficult, not for Putin to crack. So,
I'm going to give Simon the last question, the last wrap-up.
Really? I feel...
I am. Because you're so charming.
Well, it's just sweet of you to say. In that case, it's going to be a real softball. You live in Colorado now, as far away from the sea as you can possibly get. I thought you loved the sea. Why on earth do you live so far away from it?
Well, I flew airplanes, and so there's a lot of big air in Colorado.
Okay.
Thank you so much.